Today I want to share with you the best baking ingredients for your pantry so that you can be ready to bake anything. And I'm also going to cover some gluten-free ingredients. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now, the first thing I want to mention is that in this video, I really want to provide you with a lot of helpful information. And I want to start by speaking to the beginner baker. Now, if you're an experienced baker, you may want to jump ahead. So be sure to open the description underneath this video and you'll see the timestamps where I list every subject that I'm going to talk about. Now, if you're just getting started with home baking, there are some very basic supplies that you want to make sure you have in your pantry. And when I use the general term pantry, what I'm actually referring to is the Four Corners pantry. And if that term is new to you, what it refers to is your working pantry, the part of your pantry that you access every day, your refrigerator, your freezer, and then your extended pantry, or what some people call your prepper pantry. Now, your main focus as a beginner baker, is going to be creating a part of your working pantry where you keep your basic baking supplies. And you're also going to want to think about having some space in your refrigerator and your freezer where you keep those perishable ingredients that you need when baking. Now, when it comes to the ingredients that you would keep in your refrigerator and your freezer, the perishable ingredients involved in baking, I won't go into a lot of detail because those are often ingredients that serve many purposes in your kitchen and you'll usually have on hand. Things like milk, as well as eggs, butter, so on and so forth. Now, other things like buttermilk I'll talk in a little more detail about in terms of keeping a powdered buttermilk on hand. But if you also want to be able to know how to make sort of like a mock buttermilk, I have a video where I show you how to do that. And all you need is milk and some type of acid, and you can create a mock buttermilk. And I'll be sure to link to that video. But for beginning purposes, what I want to focus on are the different flours you want to think about having on hand. And if you're new to baking, I highly recommend that you start with just 1 or 2 packages of flour. And when I say flour, I actually mean flour that's been ground and is ready for you to bake with. You can certainly keep whole grain in your extended or prepper pantry, but that's something that you may want to work towards accumulating over time and as you become more experienced at baking, and once you get a grain mill and you want to start grinding your own grain. We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail as we go on in this video. But as a new baker or a beginning baker, really all you need to start with is a package of all-purpose flour. And then for your quick breads, keeping on hand some baking powder and baking soda will have you all set. And then when you want to get ready to bake yeasted breads, well, of course, then you have to have some yeast. Now, when it comes to baking powder and baking soda, they can last a relatively long time. However, once they start to get past their best by date, they're best then to replace. Because as a beginning baker, you really want to do everything in your power to help yourself be successful. So having the freshest ingredients possible is always going to work to your advantage. And when it comes to baking soda, you can always test it by putting some in a glass with some type of acid like vinegar. And if it bubbles up, it's good to go. Now, yeast, you can certainly buy this in bulk as I have here, or you can buy the little packages. And once you open something like this, you can go ahead and keep this in your refrigerator or even your freezer, which will really extend its life. And although you may not be ready to start with sourdough, I wanted to tell you, and I don't recommend it because I think if you're new to baking, especially bread baking, you'll want to try your hand at making a simple, basic sandwich bread that you bake with all-purpose flour or bread flour, which we'll talk about in a minute, and some yeast. And once you get the feel of doing that, then you can think about eventually moving on to sourdough, and you're making your sourdough starter and making sourdough bread. And if you want a recipe for a very easy sandwich bread, one made with all-purpose flour or bread flour, and then another one made with whole wheat flour, I have videos where I show you how to make these very easy sandwich breads, and I'll be sure to link to those so you can watch those if that's something that interests you. But speaking of sourdough, I just wanted to mention this in case you see this in your baking aisle. This is called instant sourdough, and I thought this was very clever because when you read on the back, it's primarily rye flour and a starter culture. And if you've seen my video on how to make a foolproof sourdough starter, I talk about using rye flour because rye flour is the easiest when trying to make a sourdough starter because there's something in the rye flour that the yeast really likes to eat, and so it helps it proliferate very quickly. So that's another video I'll link to for you too, but don't get overwhelmed. Start very simply with all-purpose flour, some baking soda, some baking powder, and some basic yeast, and you'll be all set to start baking, whether it's quick breads or yeasted breads. And I just want to mention that if you do see this, if you come across this in your baking aisle, this technically isn't real sourdough, but it'll give you bread that has that sourdough flavor. And so you can start to see, especially as a beginning baker, if that taste is something that you like. So all-purpose flour, like the name implies, really is all-purpose. You can use it for quick breads, you can use it for yeasted breads, you can use it for a variety of things that call for flour. And the nice thing about all-purpose flour is it's just got a medium protein, so it can work very well in pretty much anything. And the shelf life, when you go to buy this, chances are the expiration is going to show that maybe it's good for 1.5 years or 2 years. Now I want to mention, I also have cornstarch over here. And the reason I have cornstarch, and I recommend that you keeping this on hand, as you become more experienced and you want to use your all-purpose flour to make a batter, such as if you were making apple fritters, you will want to have a little cornstarch that you add to your flour. Because when you add cornstarch to flour and you use it where you're going to be frying your batter, such as when you're making fritters of any type, they will be a little crispier than if you left the cornstarch out. Now moving up from all-purpose flour, we've got bread flour and we've got whole wheat flour. Now all-purpose flour has all the bran and the germ removed from it. So that's why this is very easy to bake with. And bread flour is the same. It has all the bran and the germ removed from it. The only difference is that they're using a wheat that's higher in protein, and when you make bread, yeasted bread specifically, the higher the protein, the better success you'll have at getting a nice texture to your bread. Then whole wheat flour has all the bran and the germ in it. And whole wheat flour, unlike all-purpose flour and bread flour, is going to have a shorter shelf life because you've got all the oils from the bran and the germ, which can cause your whole wheat flour to go rancid quicker than those that have the bran and the germ removed. But learning to bake with whole wheat flour is a really good idea because this is going to be more nutritious than your bread flour and your all-purpose flour. But it can be a little more challenging to bake with. So as a beginning baker, what you'll want to start to do is look for recipes that incorporate a little all-purpose flour or a little bread flour along with your whole wheat flour. That will help your baked goods rise a little bit better and be a little more tender. Now the shelf life for your whole wheat flour will probably be about 1 year as opposed to 1.5 years or 2 years for those flours where the bran and the germ are removed. But if you find that you really like baking with whole wheat flour or any whole grain flour for that matter, that's the time when it's a good idea to start thinking about actually buying the whole grain and then looking into buying a grain mill. I did a lot of research before I bought my grain mill. Now, yes, you can have the old-fashioned hand crank grain mill, which I have, but when I got ready to buy an electric grain mill, I did a lot of research, and I really like the Mach Mill. And I have a lot of videos where I show unboxing it and using it, and I'll be sure to link to all of those. I'll link to all of my flour and baking videos that might be of interest to you. I'll be sure to have all of that in the description below. But if you get to the point where you're researching grain mills, I highly recommend looking at the Mach Mill. I'm very happy with it. It's a stone grind mill, and it's very affordable, and it has a lot of adjustments from 1 to 10 in terms of how you want the coarseness or less coarseness of your grain. And if it's something that you become interested in, be sure to check my shopping guide, and I'll have the links in the description below because I have a discount coupon code for my viewers, so that's definitely helps save you a little money. But let's talk about a few that considered relatively basic add-ons that you may want to think about adding to your baking pantry. And one is cake flour. Now, you can get cake flour in both an all-purpose version like what I have here, and you can also get cake flour in a whole wheat version. Now, how is this different than the rest of these? Cake flour is made from soft wheat, whereas these flours are made from hard wheat. And because this is made from soft wheat, those terms hard and soft really just refer to different varieties, but soft wheat will bake up something very light. So as the name implies, cake flour can be very good for making cakes. And if you find whole grain cake flour or whole wheat cake flour, that can be very nice if you want to make whole wheat biscuits. They'll rise very nicely. And an all-purpose cake flour like this that has the bran and the germ removed will have about the same shelf life as your all-purpose and your bread flour, and your whole wheat cake flour, if you can find that, will have about the same shelf life as your regular whole wheat flour. Other things you may want to think about adding, especially if you like making cornbread, is some type of stone ground cornmeal. And the nice thing is cornmeal is very high in the natural oils from the corn. And so make sure that you look for something that says stone ground, because that process protects the oils in the corn from being damaged. And if you have a gluten-free household, you can definitely get cornmeal, and you just want to look for ones that are guaranteed to be gluten-free. Because some crops, even though are naturally gluten-free, depending where they're grown, they may be somewhat contaminated by neighboring crops with gluten. And so specifically with corn and oats, if you definitely need things to be guaranteed gluten-free, you're just going to want to look for that designation on your packaging. Now, other flours that you want to think about adding over time are rye flour, because this is great if you decide that you want to start making your own sourdough starter and you want to start with rye flour. I highly recommend that, and know your starter won't taste like rye, and it's very easy to transition it to using all-purpose flour when you're ready to bake with it. But just starting it with a little bit of rye flour can make your life a lot easier. But then if you decide you like to make rye bread, keeping some rye flour on hand can be very handy. And I want to mention that you always want to start with small packages of these flours, especially these that are a little more on the specialty side, because you want to make sure that this is something that you're going to like baking with. So don't go out and buy, a big 25-pound bag of rye flour before you actually start baking with rye flour. And the same with any of these. I really recommend just picking the ones that are the basic size from your grocery store and see what you like baking with. That can make all the difference in the world on your budget. And if you find that you really want to start trying to make pizza or pasta, definitely keep your eyes open for this 00 flour. And this is something I found right at my grocery store, so you might find it at yours as well. Now, is that to say you can't make pizza with all-purpose flour or bread flour? Definitely you can use either of these. However, if you can find this, it really works very well. And for pasta specifically, semolina is your best bet to making a great pasta. And you'll notice if you ever buy pasta at the store and you look at the ingredients, it'll often say, durum semolina. And semolina is actually very nutritious, and I recommend, if you're going to make pasta, to use that instead of all-purpose flour. And the reason is, this is what's known as the middlings when they grind durum flour. And so it actually has a lot of nutrition. It's rather different than just white flour. And then if you make a pizza and you use some of the 00 flour and you add some semolina to it, you're going to get that nice chew that you find when you go to a pizza parlor. Also, if you find you start making bread in those round shapes known as a boule, and you're going to put it right onto a baking stone in your oven, dusting the baking stone with a little semolina can work great. You can also use cornmeal for that, as well as bran. Now, if you open the description underneath this video, there'll be a link that'll take you over to my website, Mary's Nest, same name as my YouTube channel, where I'll have a download that you can print out that'll be a checklist of all of these ingredients that we're going to cover today. So you can take that with you to the grocery store, either print it out or on your phone, and it can help you as you're shopping for these various items. Next, I want to talk about some basic sweeteners to keep on hand that you'll want to have along with your flours. The simplest thing to start with is some white sugar. And I want to mention, because I hear this from a lot of you, they say, oh, Mary, you have a lot of organic products, and organic doesn't fit into my budget. But don't worry, buy whatever fits into your budget. Those of you who are here in Central Texas like me will notice that I have a lot of products from H-E-B, our local grocery store. And they are really on a mission to provide a lot of organic products at very reasonable prices. So I tend to always buy store brands when I can. And so a lot of their store brands are organic. So that's why I do often have a lot of organic products. But you buy whatever in your budget. So as I said, white sugar is the simplest thing to start with. You can certainly buy brown sugar as well, light brown sugar or dark brown sugar, but you really don't need to if you have a bottle of molasses. And this I'm very proud of. I got this at my grocery store on clearance for $1.43. But the nice thing is, if you have sugar and you have molasses, I have a video where I show you how to make light brown sugar and dark brown sugar, and even sort of a mock sucanat, which we'll talk about in a minute over here, which is the whole dried sugarcane juice. But really the only difference between light and dark brown sugar is how much molasses you add. And so if you just have these two things, you're really set with a lot of variations for how you want to sweeten your baked goods. Now, powdered sugar can be really nice to have on hand for making icings and things like that. However, you don't even really need to buy this if you just have plain white sugar, because you can run this in your blender and turn it into powdered sugar. So you can see how just having plain white granulated sugar can come in very handy. Now, I just want to talk about jam here for a minute. I've just got some 4-fruit preserves, and then I've also got here some peach preserves. The reason I recommend keeping some jams on hand, even if you're not one to eat jam, is because these can be great if you're making cookies, like the little thumbprint cookies or different varieties like that, Linzer torts and whatnot, that require you to have some jam. And so having at least one jar of some sort of fruit jam in your pantry, in the baking part of your pantry, is definitely a smart idea. And over time, as you become a more experienced baker and you decide you want to try your hand at making pie crust, which you can easily do even just with your all-purpose flour, you'll want to have some sort of preserves on hand if you decide you want to make a tart, specifically a fruit tart. Because what you'll find is recipes will often recommend that when you're doing a fruit tart, that you coat your pie crust, your tart crust, with some sort of jam or jelly, and that you might even be coating your fruit on top with some type of jam or jelly. And they generally recommend a light colored one. You will often see apricot jam or apricot preserves, which I always sometimes have a little trouble finding that. And being that I'm in Central Texas, peaches are king here, and so I usually try to keep some peach preserves on hand, and I use this for various recipes. But so that's something to think about. Also, apple jelly, if that's easy for you to find. So that's why even in a basic pantry, I do recommend you have these. And this can even do double duty. If you want to keep this on hand for your cookies that may call for jam, having just one on hand that's a light colored one will be perfect. Now, when it comes to a traditional foods kitchen, I'm going to talk about some alternative sweeteners to help wean you eventually off of white sugar. So if you're on your journey moving from a processed foods kitchen to more of a traditional foods kitchen, these are some of the sweeteners that you're going to want to consider when it comes to baking. Maple syrup is a great option, and this can definitely serve double duty because you can use this on pancakes and waffles and for making barbecue sauce. It really can come in very handy. And generally today you'll see a lot of recipes that may call, especially when they're being made with whole grains, that'll call for using some sort of alternative sweetener. And you can always replace, well, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time you can replace a whole sweetener, one that's granulated or powdered, with a liquid sweetener like maple syrup, or in this case, honey, which I also like to keep on hand for those dried goods, those dried sugars. And there's just a little bit of an adjustment. You usually will cut back on the amount of liquid sweetener you're using in comparison. For example, if your recipe calls for 1 cup of sugar, chances are you're going to only use maybe 3/4 of a cup of maple syrup or honey, or you'll be pulling back a little on other liquids in the recipe. And I have various recipes where I show you how to bake with liquid sweeteners. And as I mentioned, I'll be sure to link to all of that in the description underneath this video. But the other sweeteners that I want to mention which I commonly use, is sucanat. And this is just dried sugarcane juice with everything intact. So it's got all the molasses and all of the various nutrients and minerals. So this is going to be more nutritious than your white sugars. Now, this is nice to bake with because this is basically a 1-for-1 replacement. It makes it very easy. So if you have a recipe that's calling for white sugar and you say, yeah, I'd like to make it a little more nutritious and try to wean myself a little bit off of the white sugar, you can go ahead and use your sucanat. Now, I want to mention that you may also see this sold under the name of Rapadura or simply dried sugarcane juice. So that's something to keep in mind when you're shopping for this. Now, another sugar I like to keep on hand, but I use this very sparingly because this is maple sugar and it's expensive. Generally, if I want to replace a white sugar and I'm not using sucanat and I want to use maple syrup, or I want to use something in the maple family, I'll use maple syrup as opposed to maple sugar. Because as I said, this is pricey, so this is not necessarily something you have to have in your beginning baker pantry. But more experienced bakers may enjoy having this because if you are doing the replacement, a 1-for-1, and you want to use something that will make your final product a little lighter in color as opposed to sucanat, which will make your final product a little darker in color, maple sugar can come in very handy. And it does not impart a strong maple flavor. So this is something to keep in mind when, say, for example, you want to make a yellow cake, but you don't want to use white sugar. Maple sugar can really be your best friend. And I talk about this in a video where I show you how to make a lot of homemade baking mixes so that you don't have to buy the prepackaged cake mixes or the prepackaged brownie mixes or the prepackaged pancake mixes and so on and so forth. And as I said, I'll be sure to link to all of these so that you can find these videos on my YouTube channel. But the bottom line is this can really save the day if you're looking to make something that is lighter in color, because the sucanat will make it darker. So keep that in mind, and you can just keep some of this maple sugar on hand, but shop around for this. I'll put a link to it in the description below. I buy mine online because I can get a better buy. At the grocery store, it can be quite pricey, So I do avoid buying that, and I tend to buy it in a larger amount because a very small bag of maple sugar will be rather expensive. I don't know exactly, I've seen it at my grocery store. All I know, I don't know exactly how many ounces it is, but it's just a small little bag and it's about $6. And this comes out a lot less per ounce. So definitely shop and see where you can get your best buy. Next, I want to mention coconut sugar. This also is a wonderful replacement where you can do 1-for-1 for white sugar, and you really don't have any coconut flavor at all. Coconut sugar tastes a lot like dried sugar cane juice. It's very similar, and it's great for baking. I really like to use this when I make oatmeal cookies, because when I make oatmeal cookies, I'll often use coconut oil and then coconut sugar. And you're not getting any coconut flavor, but you get the benefits that coconut oil can offer you, because it's very rich in nutrients. So I like, if I'm not using butter or lard, I like to use coconut oil periodically to introduce those nutrients into our family's diet. And don't forget to add some sprinkles to your baking pantry. They're perfect for topping on some Italian Christmas cookies. But keep in mind, as a new baker, if you just have some all-purpose flour, some white sugar, white granulated sugar, some molasses, some yeast, some baking powder and baking soda, you're all set. It's just this little simple grouping of items can really help you get started on your way to learning how to be a good baker. Now, when it comes to fats to use in your baking, I want to go over some of the basics that I like to keep on hand. And first and foremost, it's going to be butter. If all you have is butter, you're perfect. And specifically, I like to keep unsalted butter on hand for my baking. However, you can use salted butter if your recipe calls for salt. And then you'll just want to cut back on the salt if you're using salted butter. Now, as you expand your baking pantry and you want to add some other things, coconut oil can be a wonderful option, especially if you need to bake dairy-free. And when it comes to coconut oil, there's a huge variety on the market today, and you can find one that has a little bit of a coconut flavor with a little bit of a coconut aroma, as well as one that has no aroma and no flavor. I also like to keep some olive oil on hand for baking some Italian cakes that often call for olive oil, so that's something that you can keep in mind. It's also very handy if you find you start liking to make your own pizza dough. And when it comes to pie crust, when you get to that point, if you can find some leaf lard, this is absolutely wonderful for making the most tender pie crust. And you can mix leaf lard and butter together to get that perfect flavor and texture. Now, what's the difference between leaf lard and just lard? Lard is usually taken from the back fat of the pig, and it'll have a little bit more of that pork flavor and aroma. Leaf lard, on the other hand, is the fat removed from around the kidneys of the pig, and it's very mild in flavor, very mild in scent, and very sought after by bakers. So if you've been using things like Crisco or various vegetable oils that are highly processed, and you really want to wean yourself off of that as you move from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, if you can find some leaf lard and even regular lard, you're going to love how your baked goods come out. Finally, what I've got here is tallow. Tallow is rendered suet, and suet is beef fat that's from around the kidneys of the cow. This is wonderful whenever you're making something that you're deep frying, like those apple fritters. That'll come in handy if you have your cornstarch and your all-purpose flour. Now, I bought these to show you that you can buy these at your grocery store or at a specialty grocery store, but you can make both of these yourself. If you can get some pork fat from around the kidneys of a pig, or you can get some suet, it's very easy to render yourself. And as a matter of fact, I have a video where I show you how to take suet and render it into tallow. And I'll be sure to link to that in the description below if that's something that you're interested in. But both of these are very mild in flavor. So if for any reason you didn't have butter, or you didn't have coconut oil or olive oil, and you needed some fat for baking, well, of course, leaf lard is just going to be fabulous. But you can also use tallow. So start with butter, and as you become a more experienced baker, you've got some options as to the different types of fats you want to add. Next, I want to talk about flavored extracts and spices to have in your baking pantry that will come in very handy, especially when it comes to the spices for holiday baking. Now what I've got here is homemade vanilla extract. Vanilla extract is probably the most handy extract you want to have on hand for baking, and if that's all you have, you're fine. And I have a video where I show you how to make this. It's very easy to make homemade. And I also show you how to make a whole host of other extracts like citrus extracts and mint extract and chocolate extract. And I'll be sure to link to that video. But having vanilla extract on hand is really the best place to start. And for spices, what I've got here is a little homemade apple pie spice. You can also have homemade pumpkin pie spice. They're very easy to make. And yes, I have a video where I show you how to make them, and I'll be sure to link to that. But making your own homemade spice blends is very easy to do, and it's more cost effective than buying them in the little containers already pre-made for you. And then some of the spices I like to keep on hand are ground allspice and ground cloves, but I'll also keep the whole clove and the whole allspice berries. And I've also got over here some star anise. And I like keeping some of the whole spices because I can just grind those in one of those little spice grinders. I think I've showed you in the past. The one that I have. I actually have a couple. I found a few at thrift shops, so always keep your eyes open when you're at a thrift shop. But they're great because you can grind the spices, the whole spices, to make the spice powder that you need, and they're so fresh. But certainly having the pre-ground ones is just fine as well. And I use a lot of cinnamon, and I also use a lot of ginger. So I'll buy these ground, and I buy them in bulk because it's more cost effective. Now I want to mention as we're going through this, if there are items you like to keep in your baker's pantry that I'm not mentioning, be sure to leave it in the comments below so we can all learn from each other. Now these are just a selection of a few extra things you may want to think about adding to your baking pantry. And one is canned fruit. And this is specifically canned fruit that's made for using to make a pie. And what I've got here are sliced apples, and this is something I really like to keep on hand to make an apple pie. If I don't have any apples, or I'm just feeling a little tired and I don't feel like peeling and cutting them up. And what's great about this particular brand is this is just apples and water. And that's what I prefer to buy as opposed to apple pie filling, because I prefer to just add my own ingredients and just start with the basic apples. Next, especially as we go into Thanksgiving, having some canned pumpkin can be very helpful to make a pumpkin pie. If you don't feel like buying the sugar pumpkins and cooking them and taking out the pumpkin, this definitely makes life very easy. And these two ingredients are definitely very specialty items. Having a little espresso powder on hand when you make a chocolate cake or anything with chocolate and you add a little espresso to it, it really helps sort of bring out that chocolatey flavor. And so I always like to add a little bit of this to chocolate things. I think it just does chocolate very good. And then this is almond paste. This is wonderful because you can use this in a lot of different recipes. It's wonderful for adding to biscotti, or if you want to do an almond pound cake, or if you don't have any almond extract, this can come in handy for you if you use a little bit of this. And this is nice. It's just in a tube, and it can be very, it's very handy and has a great shelf life. Then what I've got over here is a little red food coloring, and this is just a homemade red food coloring, and I have a video where I show you how to make homemade food colorings, and I'll be sure to link to that. I think you'll find that interesting, especially if you're concerned because of different dietary restrictions and whatnot, and you can't use the store-bought food colorings because of the various chemicals or dyes that are in them. Making homemade food coloring is very easy, and it works pretty well. The colors may just be a little bit lighter than the store-bought, but especially if you're trying to get away from the dyes that are in the store-bought food colorings, I think these are great to keep on hand. So be sure to check out that video for making your own natural food coloring. And then next, what I've got over here is peanut butter. You know, and some of these things are things that you'll just have in your regular pantry. And peanut butter is wonderful to have on hand. Obviously, if you like peanut butter cookies and you want to make anything that calls for peanut butter, or any other nut butter for that matter, if peanut butter doesn't agree with you. But I think that's something good to have on hand for your baking pantry. And no baking pantry would be complete without some chocolate chips, especially if you want to make chocolate chip cookies. And I have a video where I show you how to make a whole bunch of different types of cookie mixes that you can keep handy. Already everything prepared, and all you have to do is add the wet ingredients. And I use chocolate chips in that. But chocolate chips are great because not only can you use them obviously as chocolate chips and cookies, you can melt them and use them wherever that baking chocolate or you know, sometimes I think it's called bark or chocolate bark. I prefer to have real chocolate chips that I melt down because often there are extra added ingredients to those chocolate barks that are not something I really want in my traditional foods kitchen. So just getting a nice chocolate chip, and this is 60% cacao, so it's it's bittersweet and it's leaning more to the healthy side as opposed to a full-blown milk chocolate. But it's nice because you control what other ingredients you want to add to it, and you can certainly buy, you know, sweeter chocolate chips, or you can even buy, now they have ones that are made from even dark chocolate, darker than the 60%. So that's something to keep in mind. And then I also like to have cocoa powder. This is great, again, H-E-B, but this is great, you know, when you're making a chocolate cake or chocolate cupcakes, and this will come in very handy. Here I want to share with you some dairy options to keep on hand, in addition to any perishable ones you may keep in your refrigerator. Now, some perishable items that you'll most likely have in your refrigerator when it comes to baking would be, the most simplest would be milk, either whole milk or maybe 2% milk. Sometimes fat-free milk or non-fat milk won't serve you well in every recipe, but if that's what you have on hand, it'll definitely serve for some recipes. And the nice thing about simply having milk in your refrigerator is that if you have some acid like vinegar, and I show you how to make a homemade vinegar, but if you have vinegar or lemon juice and you add that to your milk, it'll curdle it and basically make it very similar to cultured buttermilk, and it'll have the same effect in your recipes. But you may also have cultured buttermilk that you buy at the grocery store, and that works great too for certain recipes. Buttermilk makes baked goods very tender. But the nice thing is, even if you don't have buttermilk, if you have sour cream can serve the same purpose. Yogurt can serve the same purpose. They all tend to make baked goods very tender. And also having cream cheese on hand can be very handy. That goes into a lot of different recipes like cookies and of course cheesecake. And I have videos to help you with all of this, how to make buttermilk, a mock buttermilk, how to make butter and real buttermilk, how to make sour cream, how to make cream cheese. You can make all of these things homemade. And so always keep that in mind, that often if you simply have some milk and some cream, there's a lot that you can make homemade and that you don't have to buy. But if you're not in the habit of keeping perishable dairy in your refrigerator, having some options that are non-perishable on hand can be very helpful when you decide you want to bake. I always like to have some dry milk powder. Now, this is a whole milk powder. You can also keep a non-fat powdered milk on hand. It's a wonderful way to fill in for those recipes that may call for some milk, or it's also a wonderful way to add extra protein to your baked goods. You can also keep a cultured buttermilk powder on hand. This is simply buttermilk that's been dried, and when you add liquid to it, you activate it, and it can be wonderful to help whatever recipe you have that calls for buttermilk. Now, yes, these are dried, and I know many of you have told me that you're concerned about these dried products because proteins can become somewhat damaged when they're dried. So often when it comes to things like powdered milk, I try to look for those brands that do very low temp drying. Now, the buttermilk is just a commercially prepared product that's very easy to find at your grocery store. And so I don't know specifically what temperature they're drying this at. However, this does come in handy, and especially if you're not using these things frequently, I'm okay with having it on hand. Other dairy options to have on hand are sweetened condensed milk and evaporated milk. But as I've shared with you in the past, when it comes to these type of products, yes, it's handy to have some in the can as backups, but I have videos where I show you this is very simple to do. It's very simple if you have milk to make evaporated milk, and it's very simple if you have some milk to make sweetened condensed milk. So keep that in mind. But yes, I like having these, like in my emergency pantry. I did a video recently on that where I showed you how to stock not just your prepper or extended pantry, but part of that pantry devoted to emergency foods when you have no food and no water, and what are you going to do? And so having some of this on hand in the emergency pantry is great, but keep in mind they're also extremely easy to make. And for those of you who have a non-dairy household, you always have the option of coconut milk. And I like to buy the coconut milk in a can because it has a very long shelf life. So it's good to keep handy without having to worry about it going bad anytime soon. And another thing to keep in mind, which I don't show here, but I do share with you in my emergency pantry video, you can also buy goat's milk in the can that has a very long shelf life. So if cow's milk doesn't agree with you, but you find goat's milk easier to digest, that's an option to keep on hand for your baking as well. And if you have perishable goat milk in your refrigerator, you can use that to make many of the things that I've been talking about. You can use that to make an evaporated goat's milk. You can use it to make an evaporated sweetened or a sweetened condensed goat milk. And so there are options available to you if you have that in your refrigerator. But certainly you can buy it in the can, and you can do the same things as well. You can evaporate it and you can sweeten condense it. Now, before we move on to the discussion about all of the baking supplies that are gluten-free, I want to quickly take some time to talk about oats and also coconut. Having oats of any type in your baking pantry are very versatile. They're a wonderful ingredient to have on hand because not only can you use them in baking for making things like oatmeal cookies and oatmeal bread and cowboy cookies, which I'll share those recipes for all of those things with you in the description below. But if you do have a gluten-free household, oats are gluten-free. They're gluten-free naturally. However, sometimes they can be contaminated with gluten by neighboring crops. So what you want to do is look for oats that guarantee that they're gluten-free, and they will make a wonderful ingredient for you in your baking. Now, these specifically are not only gluten-free, they're also sprouted. Now, if you've seen my video where I show you how to soak and sprout grain and then turn it into sprouted flour, definitely check that out if that's something that interests you. And the reason that sprouted grains are becoming very popular is because when they're sprouted, it makes them easier to digest. I won't go into a lot of detail because I share a lot of this in that sprouted grain video. However, the bottom line is grains contain things that to us would be considered anti-nutrients, but they protect the grain when it's out in the wild. However, once you soak and sprout them, you make them very digestible for humans. And you can absorb the nutrients better. Sometimes when they're unsprouted in certain people, grains can leach nutrients from our bodies. However, once they're sprouted, they're very, what's the term, like bioavailable for us. And so finding sprouted grains is terrific. And I found this at, I believe, like a Costco or a Sam's. And I think it's a very popular item. I see it there a lot. So definitely look for this if you need something that's sprouted as well as gluten-free. And this is great for using to make oatmeal bread and oatmeal cookies and cowboy cookies. Now here are just regular old-fashioned rolled oats, and these are in the family of old-fashioned rolled oats. And these are just ones that have not been sprouted. They're just your basic old-fashioned rolled oats. Again, perfect for baking, perfect for making oatmeal with. Over here I've got the steel cut oats. These are great for turning into a nice oatmeal porridge, or if you have a grain mill, you can grind these and make your own oatmeal flour, which is wonderful. If you also have oat groats, which is the whole oat, you can also grind that to make your own oat flour. And you can also cook oat groats to make oatmeal, clearly, but to also use as a substitute for other grains like rice. It can actually be made into a savory dish. And just getting back to speaking of oat flour, if you have a blender, you can grind these into oat flour. You can grind your traditional old-fashioned rolled oats into oat flour. And in the case of this, that's guaranteed to be gluten-free, you'll have a gluten-free flour. So as you can see, having some oats in your baking pantry offer you a lot of versatility. Now what I've got here is some shredded coconut, and this is unsweetened, and that's the way I like to find coconut. And these are coconut flakes, so it's just a slight difference in the appearance, but either of these will do in your baking. The shredded coconut is probably going to come in most handy if you're doing like a coconut cake with the shredded coconut in the icing as opposed to the coconut flakes. But for just general baking, I find the coconut flakes work wonderful. And I wanted to mention this because we're sort of starting to move down the line of the gluten-free continuum, so to speak. And over here, I've got some coconut flour, which is gluten-free. Now, as I've mentioned with some of the other ingredients, I highly recommend that if you're going to be experimenting baking with coconut flour, buy a small amount and see how you like it. I find baking with coconut flour a little challenging. You often need to use a lot of eggs to help with the lift of the baked good. However, if you want to use this in cookies, substituting some of your all-purpose flour or some of your whole grain flour, I find it works relatively well. Also, if you're making your own gluten-free flour mix, coconut flour can come in very handy mixed with some other gluten-free flours, and then you can make your own all-purpose gluten-free flour mix. And I highly recommend that you experiment with that, because gluten-free flour mixes at the grocery store can be very expensive, but buying the ingredients to make your own makes it more affordable. But something that you want to keep in mind with some of these gluten-free flours and these highly specialized flours is that they often will have a shorter shelf life, especially in the case of coconut flour, because coconut has a high percentage of fat, not unlike how you have fat in your whole grain flours, which shortens their shelf life. Coconut flour has fat in it, which shortens its shelf life. And you may find that sometimes when you go to buy coconut flour, it may only have a 6-month shelf life. So if you want to bake with coconut flour, think about buying it and then baking with it rather than storing it for the long haul. Now what I've got here are a selection of flours that are gluten-free and also some ingredients that can help enhance your gluten-free flours when you bake with them. Now actually what I've got hiding back here is oat flour, but I wanted to show this to you because nowhere on this packaging can I see that it says guaranteed gluten-free. So keep your eyes open for that if you definitely need to make sure that you are guaranteed the oat flour that you're using is in fact gluten-free. Now, something I want to mention is that even though these are considered what's appropriate for gluten-free baking, these really can be very helpful to anyone who's baking. For example, even though buckwheat is gluten-free, buckwheat pancakes can be enjoyed by all of us, and they're very tasty. And buckwheat flour is extremely nutritious, and this is no kind of newfangled thing. This has been around for over 8,000 years. And so you can't go wrong in no matter what way you're baking or cooking when it comes to using buckwheat flour. What I've got here is chickpea flour, and this is so versatile. I was even reading that you can just add some water to this and make a quick and easy hummus. And so I'm going to have to give that a try one day. We really like hummus here, and I have a video where I show you how to make hummus with a lot of tips and tricks to really get it very similar to what you can buy at the grocery store. Really nice and smooth. And I'll be sure to link to that video. But in any event, chickpea flour is great. You can use this when you're putting together a gluten-free baking mix. You can also just go right ahead and bake with this. This is used to make a very delicious flatbread. And forgive me, you know I'm the queen of mispronunciation, so you can always put it in the comments phonetically for me. But I think it's pronounced socca, S-O-C-C-A, and it's a flatbread, and you can make it a little on the thicker side, or you can make it real thin, like a crepe, and or a tortilla even. And then you can use it to in the same way you would use a tortilla or a crepe, to roll it up with some nice ingredients, and you've got something that's completely gluten-free. And chickpeas are also very nutritious. And what's nice about this is that you can also use this if you need to like thicken a stew or thicken a soup. It's so versatile. It can come in handy whenever you're cooking and something calls for a little bit of flour, like thickening a stew. Just use your chickpea flour. You're not going to notice any specific chickpea flavor, and it's going to do the job beautifully. Now over here I've got the cornmeal. We talked about this a little bit back in the beginning. Again, like the oats, if you want to use cornmeal in your baking, you just want to make sure that it actually is designated as gluten-free if you need to make sure that you're guaranteed it's gluten-free. Now what I've got here is rice flour, and this is white rice flour. Can you use brown rice flour? Certainly. However, something you want to keep in mind is that the shelf life for brown rice flour is going to be relatively short because, again, the oils in it are going to go more rancid quicker than when the bran and the germ from the rice are removed. And rice flour is wonderful for using as a base when you're making a gluten-free flour mix. However, it's also great for whenever you're going to try to do some frying. If you add this to a batter, maybe where you're going to dip in some onions and make onion rings or something like that, rice flour is wonderful. Now, keep in mind, I'm showing you this because I want it to be clear to you that yes, you can buy this already prepared, but making rice flour is extremely easy. If you have a high-speed blender and you've got some white rice, you might even be able to do it in a regular blender. You'd want to check with your manufacturer's instructions, but you can just grind the white rice and you'll have white rice flour. Now what I've got over here is tapioca flour, and this is gluten-free. This comes from a root, the cassava root, that's basically dried and ground up. And it's a wonderful base for making your gluten-free flours. And tapioca flour is wonderful to use as a thickener. Whenever flour is called for to thicken something, just use your, like all-purpose flour, just use your tapioca flour in place of that. This is also wonderful in pies. So instead of, like, say you're making an apple pie and you've got a gluten-free crust and then you want to make your apple pie filling and you need to thicken it a little and you don't want to use flour, use tapioca. This is great even if you're not gluten-free. I love to use tapioca as the thickener for my pie fillings. I think it has a very nice flavor and doesn't have that sort of, sometimes you can get a little bit of a residual uncooked flour flavor sometimes in a pie, but you won't get that with tapioca. This works beautifully as a thickener. Now I want to mention there are a wide variety of gluten-free flours out there today, so I highly recommend you take a little time looking in the baking aisle at your grocery store. I'm really just touching the tip of the iceberg here with some that are more common, but there are all types of things that I saw at my grocery store, even cauliflower flour. So there's a whole host of things. I mean, it's just a whole new world in the baking aisle. And if you are gluten-free, I think you're going to be very pleased with all the new flours that are coming out and being available for the gluten-free kitchen. Now what I've got here is arrowroot flour, and this is wonderful to use as a base, again, for whenever you're making a gluten-free flour mixture. Arrowroot flour is also wonderful to use as a thickener in place of regular flour, and also, like tapioca, is great for thickening pie fillings. Arrowroot flour is also very digestible, and I remember as a toddler my mother making like little biscuits, little cookies from arrowroot flour, and I think that this was sort of a common practice because it's so easy to digest that it was something that was good for toddlers. So that's kind of something interesting to look into. Also, something that's very important to know about arrowroot flour is that if you have to bake where you eliminate eggs, arrowroot flour can come in very handy. All you're going to do is take a little bit of your arrowroot flour and whatever fat that you're using, it could be a little olive oil or other oil, it could be a little coconut oil that you've brought up to room temperature, or a little above room temperature, because it tends to be a little solid at room temperature, but get it to where it's in more of a liquid state and mix in your arrowroot flour, and that will make a wonderful substitute for an egg. Now this is a little unrelated to flours, but talking about egg substitutes, and something that I didn't include here today, but that you want to think about having in your baking pantry is applesauce. Applesauce is wonderful as an egg substitute, and it also can just bring a lot of moisture into quick breads that can sometimes tend to be dry. And when you bake with applesauce, it helps keep your baked good, especially your quick breads, a little moist, a little more fresh for a few days longer than when you've not used applesauce. And I want to mention, when you're shopping for gluten-free ingredients, you may just have to look around the packaging a bit to see if what you're buying is in fact gluten-free. For example, this cornmeal makes it very clear. That's, your eye's gonna spot that right away. And then here, it's more in the middle of the package, and sometimes on the Bob Red Mill package, they'll just have a little red circle with GF up in the corner there. And so just keep your eyes open, and again, like with the oat flour, I was not able to find that on the package, so I can't be guaranteed that that is gluten-free. But if something is gluten-free, today most manufacturers will make it very clear somewhere on their packaging that it is in fact a gluten-free ingredient. Now this is a product that is gluten-free and that will help stabilize, in essence, the gluten-free flours that you use to bake with. And this is called xanthan gum. And excuse me if my pronunciation is not correct. But as I said, this is gluten-free, and this is often added to whatever gluten-free flours or gluten-free flour mixture you want to use to bake with, because this will help work as a thickener, as a stabilizer. It's just an excellent ingredient to have on hand. This can also be used as a gelling agent if you can't use some of the other gelatins that are available that may not fit in with a vegetarian or a vegan dietary lifestyle. This can be used in place of that. So I hope this will get you started if you're new to gluten-free baking, but if you're an experienced gluten-free baker, be sure to put your ideas in the comments below, your recommendations for putting together gluten-free flour mixes or particular flours you like baking with that are gluten-free, because that'll really help the beginners, because I am not an experienced gluten-free baker. I'm working on it because I know so many of you have asked me about it, and that's why I'm trying out some of these flours. But if you are an experienced gluten-free baker, please help all of us in the comments below. Alrighty, now let's move on to talking about baking with ancient grains. I love baking with ancient grains. And if you're an experienced baker with ancient grains, or you're just beginning to start baking with ancient grains and you're really happy with the baked goods that you're able to create, definitely let me know in the comments below. First, I want to talk about some of the flours that I keep on hand, and then we'll talk about how I really like to keep the whole grains on hand. Now, when it comes to ancient grains, your main ancient grains are going to be einkorn, and then emmer, which some of you may know as farro, and then spelt, and then somewhere in that timeline, something known as kamut. Now, kamut is sort of a registered trademark name, so you may also see kamut described as Khorasan wheat. Now, there are a lot of ancient grains out there, but specifically what I'm focusing on here are the forerunners to modern-day wheat. Now, if you're interested in learning about all the ancient grains, as well as just all grains in general, I have a video which I'll definitely link in the description below where you can learn more about that, because ancient grains are very interesting. Many are naturally gluten-free, and overall they're very nutritious. In that video I discuss things like millet and barley and more, so definitely check that out. But what I've got here are the ancient grains that basically, as I mentioned, were the forerunners to what we think of as modern-day wheat. And probably two of the most popular ones are einkorn and spelt. And einkorn is considered the most ancient of the ancient grains and is the lowest in gluten. Now, these do contain gluten, so if you have a condition where you have to be 100% gluten-free, these will not work for you. However, I have read that people who may just have some gluten intolerances but don't need to avoid it completely find that einkorn and spelt agree with them. So it's definitely something worth experimenting with if you can have some gluten in your diet. Now, baking with einkorn is very interesting because the gluten is low. You might find when you start out baking with einkorn that you will like to use an all-purpose version of einkorn. Now, the bran and the germ have been removed, but even so, the all-purpose version of einkorn flour is healthier than the all-purpose version of modern-day wheat flour. And you'll even notice when you look at the differentiation in color that einkorn flour, even all-purpose einkorn flour, will have a little bit of a pale yellow tint to it because it's very high in beta-carotene. Now, you can also buy 100% whole grain einkorn flour, but when you go to bake, you can actually mix these together to help lighten the whole grain einkorn flour. And never feel bad about adding some all-purpose flour, regardless of what type of all-purpose flour you're using, to your whole grain flour when you're baking. This is a very ancient way of baking because our ancestors would have been grinding their own grain, and they actually learned to sift out a little bit of the bran and the germ because they found that they were able to make a lighter bread product. This was very common in the Middle Ages. Now, if you're not grinding your own grain and then sifting it, you can create this sort of mixed flour by taking your whole grain flour and just adding maybe a 1/4 cup or a 1/2 cup of all-purpose flour to your whole grain flour, and then using that flour to bake your bread or your quick bread or whatever the case may be. Now, after einkorn, in terms of the ancient grain continuum, next would be emmer. Now, emmer flour is not something that's commonly found at a grocery store or even a specialty store. Emmer, which as I mentioned earlier is often referred to as farro, is often cooked as a grain, as a savory grain to eat in place of rice or something like that. Now, I've got some whole grain emmer here, which we'll talk about the whole grains in a minute. But something that I want to mention, that when you are looking for these, when you're shopping for them, sometimes it can get very confusing because all of this can be referred to as farro. You may see einkorn called piccolo farro, meaning small farro, and you may see spelt as being called grande farro, or the big farro. And then your emmer is the medio farro, or a medium-sized grain. And the reason they have these names is that when you look at the whole einkorn, I think I've got some here, it's on the smaller side. Then the emmer, or the farro medio, or medio farro, is a little bigger. And then spelt is the biggest of these three ancient grains. So I don't want you to get confused if you see them all often. Sometimes in recipes or when you're reading online, they'll use the term farro, and it can get a little confusing. But they'll also generally put the small, the medium, or the large. So you'll know they're talking about einkorn, emmer, or spelt. So after the einkorn, after the emmer, next you have spelt in terms of the age on the ancient grain continuum. And I really like baking with spelt. And I think if you're new to baking with ancient grains, spelt is a great place to start. Yes, it does have a little more gluten than the einkorn, and it has a little more gluten than the emmer, but spelt can bake up a beautiful baked good. It can create something that's not exactly like using all-purpose flour, but it's not going to be as dense, I find, as using modern-day whole wheat. Now, what I've got here is a 100% whole grain spelt, so the bran and the germ are intact. And when I bake with this, whether I'm making a quick bread or cookies or even a yeasted bread or a sourdough bread, I find I'm always happy with the results. So definitely think about starting on your ancient grain journey with spelt. Now what I've got here is Vital Wheat gluten. Now, if you're running a gluten-free kitchen, you don't want to have this in your kitchen. However, if you're baking with ancient grains that are lower in gluten and you're not eating them because they're lower in gluten, but because they're more nutritious than the modern day wheats, but you find that you're not happy with the results of your baked good, you can go and add in a little extra gluten. And that's what Vital Wheat gluten can be used for in the baker's pantry. Now, I've never really found it necessary to add extra gluten to spelt. I love baking with spelt. I think it works great. Einkorn is a little bit of a different story, and I do find adding Vital Wheat gluten to einkorn, especially when you're making a sourdough or a yeasted bread, I do find adding a little bit of the Vital Wheat gluten to the einkorn is very helpful to get a nice rise out of it. So experiment with your einkorn, and then if you find you're not happy with the results, think about adding some Vital Wheat gluten to it if gluten's not a problem for you. Now, I do keep small amounts of ancient grains in their flour form on hand. However, I generally like to keep the actual whole grain on hand. And what I've done here is just put some small amounts in some plastic bags to show you, because I generally keep these in those large 5-gallon buckets. And I have a lot of different videos on how to store food for your extended or prepper pantry. I'll be sure to put the link to that entire playlist in the description below. But what I wanted to show you today was the whole grains that I like to keep on hand, because these have a very long shelf life. Depending on which grain that you're looking at, and I discuss all of this in my video about where I cover all grains for storing in your prepper pantry. Some have a very long shelf life. Some will say 20, 25 years easily, which is amazing. And others that are a little higher in oils, maybe 8 to 10 years. But as long as they've not been ground into flour, they have a very long shelf life. So that's why I really like to keep them on hand. And then when I want to bake, I just use what's kind of hidden behind there, behind some of those different spices and whatnot, is my mock mill. And I'll just grind my flour fresh. And I have to tell you, grinding flour fresh is just, I think it's just wonderful. And I think that it creates such flavor that you really can't match when you use your pre-ground flours. They just, I think, are wonderful. Also, what I've got here is the kamut, or the corrosion wheat. I don't keep this on hand in a flour form. I don't use a lot of this, but it is definitely something that you can consider adding into your baking pantry. If you do, I recommend that you think about keeping it whole and then getting a grain mill eventually, unless you find that you're able to find some corrosion or Khorasan, excuse me, I'm pronouncing it wrong, Khorasan or kamut wheat that's already been ground into flour, and you bake with it and you find you really like it and you'll use it quickly, then certainly you can buy it in the flour form. But with, as I mentioned, with any whole grain, once you grind it into flour, it does have a little shorter shelf life because you've got all the bran and the germ intact. Now, I just want to mention, when it comes to einkorn, I find this works very well when making bread, whether it's a sourdough or a yeasted bread. When it comes to spelt, I find this is a wonderful all-purpose flour. Now, I use the term all-purpose basically to mean I can use it to bake pretty much anything, but I'm using it as a whole grain flour. It's very nutritious, and I find that it works well in yeasted bread, sourdough, cookies, quick breads. It's just a wonderful, versatile flour. Now, as far as the emmer or farro medio, and the kamut go, I don't keep a lot of them on hand. When it comes to the kamut, I actually keep a very small amount on hand, and I may just throw in 1/4 cup or 1/2 cup when I'm grinding some of the other grain, and then just add that into my flour mix for whatever I'm baking, just to broaden the nutritional profile. And the same goes for the emmer. I'll simply throw in 1/4 or 1/2 cup with some spelt or einkorn, whatever I'm using, and again, just to expand the nutritional profile. Sometimes I'll even mix einkorn and spelt and emmer and the kamut together just to make a sort of multi-grain variety. But primarily, I'm going to be baking with einkorn and spelt. So I highly recommend those two. They're definitely my favorites. Now, if you'd like to get baking, be sure to click this video over here where I show you how to make an easy sandwich bread perfect for beginners, and it's tasty and popular because it has over 1 million views, and it's part of a playlist with a lot of other wonderful baked goods that you can make. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.